Well, welcome. My name is Tamara with Love in a Big World, and my guest today is Margaret Brown with Creative Unblock. And today we're going to be talking about how we can use creativity to create calm in this stressful world in which we're living. So just so you know, friends, how this works, we are so glad to know who you are and where you are in the world, so you can add that to chat as you join in. And if you have questions as we go along, you can add that. What we'll try to do is reserve the last 5 to 7 minutes to answer your questions directly. But we are so glad you're here. So Margaret, it is so good to meet you.
You as well. Thank you for having me. Yes, we've talked a couple times. Yeah, on the phone. It's really nice to have a face to the name. So
yes,
yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So to get us started, would you please give us a little bit more information about who you are and what you're doing these days?
Sure. Yeah. So I have a background in art education. That was 10 years ago is when I went to school for that. And then I did that for 5 years. And then I went on my own and became a full-time artist myself. And then what I realized is as I was going through this process, which is obviously vastly different processes of being in the education system and then teaching the art, and then going and then turning around and then creating your own art form and figuring out how to create a business out of it. So it was a little bit of the flip side. But what I realized, I became, as much as I was interested in creating the art, I also became very interested in the process of how we create, how we can create, how we can tap into that creativity, because so much of it is just so unknown. I think a lot of people out there, there's a lot of unknowns about how to be creative and how do we tap into that. And it's actually not as complicated as we think it is. But that's been really my goal. Is then I ended up helping when I was, as I'm painting full time, I was asked by a nonprofit to help them with some art therapy to incorporate into their portion of how to help these individuals. And it was small group setting. So I came in and I created a curriculum for them. And for the first time, I saw a way that basically what ended up happening when I was teaching, I loved teaching and I loved being there for my students, but you could tell that even though I was helping them with their technical skills, I was helping them create concepts and very in-depth ideas, there was something missing, and you could see a lot of the students really stressed out, with emotional issues that I could not address just in the time frame, which I know all these teachers know this. So when I started making this curriculum for the first time ever, I saw a way that I could implement it, that I could actually help blend the two careers together, which is education and then being an artist myself, in order to bring it to everyone so they could realize how important it is, how therapeutic it can be, and really just an advocate for the arts, in the sense that it's not just for people that want to be a full-time artist, it's for everyone. This is a whole hemisphere of the brain that really needs to be tapped into, and everybody has that access. We just don't know how to access it yet. So really just trying to inform individuals of how easy it is to do it. And then I created the Creative Unblock, which is more of a system of individuals that come with us that are stuck, various ages, various issues, but really just implementing these simple processes to unblock situations in their lives by accessing the right hemisphere, that creativity, that creative side of themselves. So that's really how the Creative Unblock has been fleshed out. So, yeah.
I'm so excited to talk with you because obviously all of us are under a great deal of stress with the quarantine, living in a different world because of the pandemic. So for students as well as for teachers and caregivers, family members, how can we use creativity to help restore calm and well-being?
Sure. So it's important to know first the concept of the different hemispheres of the brain. That's important because what happens is the right hemisphere. So if it, just to kind of separate it very quickly, if you don't know anything just about how it works, is The left hemisphere is your analytical mind. It's language recognition, it's communication, it's writing, it's linear. Then you have your right hemisphere, which is all of the pictures that we take in, all of the body language that we read, our body spatial recognition of things that are around us, that's all right hemisphere. So it communicates via pictures. So what's happened is it's not so much that we have to do these things in order to calm ourselves, but it's actually a process of, instead of being so analytical and problem solving all the time, which is obviously what everybody wants to do right now, is just shifting into your right hemisphere that actually naturally lights up the right hemisphere and combines the two together, that ends up calming you down. So it's the way that we do that is it seems paradoxical, and that's why a lot of people don't do it. But what ends up happening is that you're either in two sense of modes. You're either in survival mode, like we are in a way now in our thinking process, or we're in a creative mode. We're in a safe process. We're in a situation that we feel that we can create. So what's happens is because we're so analytically driven, what ends up happening is it's what there's been several books written about it. It's called The Art of War, or The War of Art, The Art and Fear. And basically what I have realized is that what that is just too much on the analytical side, the worried about the future, worried about the past. Mm-hmm. And when that takes over, what it does is it tells you, I don't have time to create. I don't have time to go for a run. I don't have time to be in nature. I don't have time to doodle, or whatever that is for you. I don't have time to write music or, tinker with some sort of toy, because we're too worried about what's going on. But what we don't realize is in order to calm our bodies down and our minds, if we just tap into that, if we force ourselves to do that, then it actually naturally calms ourselves down. But it's hard to get there because there's so much resistance doing that, because we think, oh, no, we're in survival mode. We can't do anything that's playful or do anything that is going to take us out of, to stop worrying about this quote unquote problem right now that we're constantly trying to solve. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what it is it's kind of bypassing the resistance, that, oh no, I can't do anything today other than worry about this one problem. But the resolution is actually to say, no, I'm going to take a pause, and I'm going to do something either creatively or something that has something to do with our bodies that help us kind of tap into that right hemisphere, as opposed to just being in our minds all day. So a couple ways we do that is, a lot of times it's very similar to what I like to call creativity is kind of the Trojan horse. So you can communicate two different ways. You can communicate through a paragraph, which obviously you would have to read the whole entire thing, or you could draw a picture or create it somehow. Mm-hmm. One will actually give you information, but you kind of have to break it up, individually. You can't read a whole paragraph in one look at it, one overview, but a picture can communicate so many different things. And what's interesting about it is it's you telling yourself different information, because you're giving that right hemisphere an opportunity to explain something to you, to express something to you, just like a written format would, if that makes sense.
Yes. So what I'm hearing you say is that we can intentionally tap into that more creative part of our brain, and
yes.
in doing that, we can calm ourselves down. That just happens naturally.
Yes.
Okay. So what are some tips for making that shift? Because like you said, we're in constant problem solving mode. And right now, so many of us are living in fight or flight mode because of the pandemic. So what are some tips or tricks to kind of bypass that analytical side of our brain so that we can dig into the creative?
Sure. So basically some tips and tricks is a lot of the time what ends up happening, you can do it one or two ways. You can either do it by forcing yourself to put yourself in a different environment that's going to make you be aware of your body, using your senses. So the best way to do that is to either get into nature, because you're automatically having to register what's going on around you, right? So instead of being on technology where it's all heady all the time. So, and then also statements to yourself. So for instance, one example I can give you, or actually multiple examples, the clients that we work with, one of the biggest parts is, I am going to make this a judgment-free zone for you. I'm not going to judge you on your creation. That's not the point here. The point is to really enjoy the process of creating, really enjoying what you're doing, not the final product, right? Which is so antithesis of what, you know, a lot of times grades can be, and, you know, what we're taught as teachers. Another thing is when we talk about doing it, is a huge form is reintroducing play. Like, what does play look like? What does that even mean? It's freedom to explore. It's freedom to experiment. It's freedom to ask yourself, well, what if I did this? You know, that makes you really excited about whatever you're trying to create. So a lot of times it's just reteaching yourself to address the same problem, but to come from it in a more positive, more expansive way, right? So those are just like a couple of tidbits that whatever you're doing, whether it's writing music or whether it's creating a poem or whether it's drawing, whatever it is, it's like I used to put a sign on my studio before I would create every day. And it says, I'm just going in here to play. That's all I'm doing. No expectation. I'm not going to worry about who I'm going to sell it to. I'm not going to worry about who my buyers are, because that's not the point, because you'll never get there. You'll never get to create what's really going on inside of you if you're already worried about the judgment that's going to face you on the other side.
Right. Oh, so good. That's so good, Margaret. So I'm wondering about a couple things. And then I want to dig into some of our other talking points. But when you're talking about this judgment-free zone, and you mentioned grades, as educators, especially educators in this virtual world today, how can we communicate this idea of play to our students so that they can be more creative, whether it's it could be something that they're going to write, like you mentioned, whether it's poetry or a story or some other creative response. Maybe it's a video that they're going to create or a piece of art. But how can we communicate that even in this virtual world to our students to help them calm down?
Absolutely. Yeah. So what I realized when teaching is, you know, you can give them a set of requirements and then be very tedious about the grading system of whatever it is. Or what you can do is you can present them a couple of boundaries, you know, 3 or 4 boundaries, like the parameters, whatever that is to you. And then you give them a concept and then you say, go with it. So the less you can kind of manhandle the requirements, you know, like the micromanagement, like who likes to be micromanaged, the more you can lay down some just like simple tools or boundaries. And then you come up with some sort of concept, whatever you're trying to teach your students. And then you let them do it however they want to express it. Because this is also this was always very frustrating for me, specifically when I was in the school system, which was, you know, I would have so many kids come up to me and be like, well, I'm not an artist, I can't draw. Like, art is everywhere. Life is art. Art is life. It's everything. And especially in this technology world, I mean, some of the most amazing things are being created because of technology, you know? So, you know, if you're drawing or illustrating on Photoshop, that's just as creative as somebody painting a picture. You know, I think what we also need to do is broaden the horizons of what creativity is, because I think we have such a limited concept of what that means. Because at some point in our lives, and, you know, when you look at the, which I know several of you teachers know this information, but when you look at the development of a child, you know, when they first go to a piece of paper or whatever they're tinkering with or creating, they're not doing it with the end in mind. They're doing it just for the simple purpose of doing it. And then what ends up happening is, as we grow up, which ends up being higher elementary or middle school, it becomes where our brain is developing. We want things to be more concrete. So then we try to draw things exactly like the hand or exactly like the whatever. If it's not exactly right, we quit. So then what ends up happening is we stop really putting energy and focus into whatever that creativity is at such a young age. And then we kind of take over and just start using our analytical mind. So there was actually a study done by NASA, and they did a test. They were actually using this specific test for to hire people at NASA to be the problem solvers. And they were like, oh man, this test is so, you know, simple. We could give it to kids. Let's see how they test. And so basically it was like the creative genius test. Like, who doesn't want to be a creative genius? And so then they tested, and I'm gonna butcher the numbers a little bit, but I'll give the information to you later. So if anybody wants to look at it, because it was a TED Talk. It was at 3 years old, I think it was 3 or 4 years old, 98% of the students were considered creative geniuses. And basically all that means is that they presented a problem to these children, and these children came up with these amazing results and different outcomes because they weren't limited. But then those same individuals at like age 33, it was like, you know, I think it was like 2% or 3%. We're the only ones that were tested as creative geniuses. So what does that tell us? That tells us a lot of information. We can't limit our students. We'll limit them, you know, it's, you know, with creativity in general, in any class, I'm assuming, is that, you know, you have these parameters that you give them so they can move forward, so they have some sort of motivation and idea where they're going with it. But then you let them kind of explore it in many possibilities as possible. But what I found is the more you micromanage it, the more difficult it is for students to really find their place in creativity. Because if you're like, well, you can only use pencils and markers, right? And you can only draw a landscape or whatever it is, and it has to be in this style, you have stagnated the process so quickly. Yes, they may learn from it and some may excel, but what I have found, the projects that were the best and that so many of the kids really took a lot from it, was when they were able to express themselves the way that they wanted to, not the way that I wanted them to, or another teacher. So that was a little long-winded, but hopefully I answered your question.
That is really good. So I'm just sitting here thinking about, you know, with Love in a Big World, we focus on social and emotional learning. Mm-hmm. And we define social and emotional learning as helping kids identify what's going on in their head and in their heart so they can use their hands to build up and not tear down. Mm-hmm. And a lot of times I'll talk with people about the role that art and play have with helping us get in touch with what's going on in our heads and in our hearts. Absolutely. And how we can even use those places of creativity for problem solving, right? Mm-hmm. So even if we're not cognitively aware, we're practicing those skills of what it means to interpret what's going on in our own selves, as well as in relationship with others. Absolutely. And I hear you saying that a lot too in what you're talking about. So can you share a little bit more about some experiences or breakthroughs, some of that unblocking that has happened that you've seen, where maybe someone that you've been working with, whether it's in the school setting or another setting that you've talked about, is working through their art and then they have an emotional or social breakthrough that really helps them advance and move forward in life?
Yes, absolutely. So a lot of times what we do is we implement very simple criteria where we're asking them to communicate something through color, through shape, and then through size. And so even though that seems very simple, what you're doing is you're allowing that right hemisphere to start communicating to yourself. And what ends up happening is aha moments come from that. It comes from that because, like I said, it's very similar to if the left hemisphere communicates, like if we have a whole brain, the whole point is one's not bad and one's not good necessarily, but it is out of shape right now because of society, how we've established our society. And so basically what you're doing is, or what we've done is we're blending both together. So what we do is we ask them to create a problem, and then we use playful techniques to come up with that, or to even just explain the problem. It's not even coming to the conclusion, but what's beautiful about it is visually, like I said, a Trojan horse, when they do that and they communicate that visually, then they end up answering their own questions just based on what they created. Because what they've done is they haven't limited themselves with creating, because so many people are so hesitant to even try, right? Like they won't even try. But if the left brain communicates through language and through writing, the right communicates through imagery and pictures. So if we're not doing any of that, then we're not using a whole hemisphere of our brain. So, but when we do, when we make that connection and the whole brain lights up, what ends up happening is the aha moment. Because even if you know the information, but it just keeps on rattling around in your mind, you know, that's obviously, you know, it's like what you're doing is, instead of just rattling around in your mind, of course you can journal about it, but then you've kind of manifested those thoughts, right, on a piece of paper or whatever creation that is. And then it helps you have a different perspective because you see it in so many different ways, right? You see it in different colors. You've communicated it in different ways as opposed to just writing in words, which then therefore communicates something to you back when you try to explain it to someone. And what's so beautiful about it is a lot of times, what ends up happening is, because you've created it and you're so close to it, you may not see something that's so obvious to the viewer, because the viewer is like, well, obviously this is really important to you, or this is not good for you, but they don't see it because they're so close to it. So some of the aspect of it too is the actual discussion part. So, and that's why it's really important to do the safe space and no judgment, because then there's also another barrier with individuals. How can we tap into this, but then also not feel that people are going to be judged, and they're not going to want to put themselves out there because they think people are going to either make fun of it or whatever the case may be. But that's what ends up happening, is so much is communicated just visually, and you may not be able to see it, but somebody may see it very easily.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So you've alluded to this a couple times. Why are we a left brain dominant society? What contributes to it?
Sure. So, so obviously, lots of teachers know this, but, you know, our school system was established, you know, because of the Industrial Revolution, right? We put all the chairs in together, orderly, we teach everybody the same. And obviously we've kind of evolved over time, but what's happening now is, you know, what I notice about my students, which is a really good example, is, you know, they would sit down with each other, instead of asking like, how are you doing? How's your day? Or, you know, it would be, you know, what are your ACT scores? Well, mine's this, what's yours?
Mm-hmm.
And so what you've done is you've measured up. Western society has a tendency to be very competitive, which is great, but can also be very negative, especially when in academics or, you know, in sports or whatever the case may be. But if that's the way we're setting people up, instead of, so the point is, well, what do I have to do to make the grade? I don't care what I'm learning. I don't care if I'm getting anything out of it. I just want to make the grade, right? Instead of saying, hey, you know, I want to take this class because I'm going to learn a lot from it, because therefore I want to eventually get a job that will pay me, that I can do this for the rest of my life. So I think sometimes we forget why these children are going to school in the first place, right? Why aren't we asking more questions about like, hey, you know, because I hear so many times when I taught art, oh, I love art, Miss Brown, but I can't take it because I have all of these other classes, AP classes I have to take, right? To get into the school that I want, to get to where I want to get in life. But, and so many times they haven't been asking the right questions. The right question is, if you love it, if the whole point of going to school is to get paid for your occupation and then to love doing it, then shouldn't that be the question and not our test scores? You know, because ultimately that's the whole point of going to school, right? We go to school so we can learn what we love, learn what we enjoy doing. So then therefore we can go into the workforce and do that every day, right? But then we have this process of, you know, the midlife crisis, which is, oh man, I totally forgot to ask myself these really important questions as I was going through school. All these other people have already decided for me. And now I'm stuck being like, oh man, I've got to wipe it clean or have a breakdown, because now I'm finally ready to ask myself those questions like, do I even like this job? Do I even want to live here? Do I, you know, like the building that I have set up? You know, do I like the ladder that I've been climbing? You know, as they say, you know, there's different buildings and you spend your whole entire life climbing a ladder, but did you look to see if it's the right building that you want to be climbing, you know, or are you supposed to be on another building, you know, right next door? So anyway, so that's, I kind of got on a little tangent there, so I apologize.
No, you're good. I think I'm smiling because so much of what you're saying is in line with what I believe and some of the reset conversation that's happening as far as education goes. I think we've been given a great privilege now through the pandemic to change the way we do school and to reconsider, just exactly as you were saying, what is the end goal?
Yes.
And if it's to help people, like you said, find out what they love to do and create those skills so they can make a living doing what they love and provide for their family and live a happy and healthy life, then that's a very different trajectory than just earning that grade, as you've been talking about. So I want to give some time for friends to ask some questions, and I think one has come in already. Yes, there's a question about if this is going to be recorded. Yes, that's going to be recorded, and we will share it. We'll share that link with you. It'll be on Facebook Live later today, and then also on YouTube, so we'll share that. If you have any questions right now for Margaret or for me about this conversation, please go ahead and either ask that through the chat or through Q&A. So again, I want to go back to this idea, Margaret, of using art to help calm us and connect us. Can you tell us more about that? How can we use art in that way?
Sure. So, so I wanted to touch one more thing on the school system situation, because I think I got a little off. But to reiterate, when we created the school systems, we set it up testing, you know, to have tests to score. And then, and obviously, you know, we need to know that information, obviously, as they go through the school system. But then if you look at where things are going, you know, the individuals that will probably excel are going to be your creators. They're going to be the inventors. They're going to be the people that are going to start solving these problems that we've never had to face before. And so, you know, we're going to have to reevaluate the education system, obviously, because it's more important than ever that we're cultivating the concept of problem solving in various ways, various options. So, so when they do get into, once they graduate and they do create their careers, that they know how to use these tools. They know how to use the whole brain and not just part, because, you know, as people know, even just this epidemic has shown us, like, you know, who can pivot really quickly, who can learn really fast so they can, you know, explore different avenues. I've seen so many interesting creative things that have come about just because everybody's stuck in their house, which obviously there's cons to it, but there are some really interesting pros to it. So that's what I wanted to say about just the education system, is if we don't implement it soon, and if we don't implement it at such a young age, they won't have the right tools once they graduate, and they'll be lost. So we have to start implementing it now, and then that way they're more successful in the future when they graduate.
And just to piggyback on that, Margaret, what I would add is we're seeing, what I'm hearing from employers is the need for that problem solving, as you mentioned, and that creative problem solving, but also those social skills. So when you can connect the two, the art and creativity and those social skills, then you really have a quality contribution, right? From an individual who is, whether it's in an entrepreneurial setting or whether it's in a large corporation, it's how can we think out of the box? And as you said, you know, another friend of mine here in town, I think it was last year, wrote an article about the role of AI and how so many of us as people are being replaced by machines. But if we use that creativity and if we use our social skills, then we can't be replaced. And so I think that's all things that we need to keep in mind. So before we go, Margaret, what are some closing thoughts?
Some closing thoughts. Well, you know, to kind of what you were saying, just to kind of reiterate, there's a TED Talk that I think is really beneficial, and it's called The Stroke of Insight. And it talks a lot more about the left and right hemisphere, because what you're also talking about, it's important to be creative, but then it's also important to be able to remember how to connect with individuals, to how to empathize with individuals. And this is also something that is definitely on the right hemisphere as well. Because why do we want to problem solve if we don't have the end goal to help, right? Because I also think that that is really important too, where, you know, I had a friend of mine when I was just painting. I had a friend of mine, and I just told her, I was like, you know, I just want to paint. I want to create all day. And that's all I want to do right now. And she said, but how are you contributing to society? And I was like, wow, that it really just put into perspective, like, we all should have that. Ideally, we should all have that end goal in mind, is how can we how can we feel fulfilled with our careers and our lives, but then also how can we contribute back using those same, you know, those tools and skills that we've learned through creativity. So yeah, I think that was all I was going to say. But yeah, as far as we do have on the Creative Block, we do have a 30, if you sign up for our newsletter, you have a 30-day challenge that gives you different projects for your kids. And those are implemented specifically thinking about the creative genius, which are all tools that you have at home. And so if anybody wants to check out, they can. And then also I've created tutorials and videos for how to create mandalas, which is a great way of helping de-stress and calm the mind. So that's also something you can do as well, or anything really that helps, anything that's like doodling, or anything that just is almost tedious in a way, where your analytical mind can kind of drop out and be like, oh, I'm not needed anymore. It could be tinkering. It can be taking something apart. It can be anything of like that will actually help you de-stress and calm, because the analytical mind's like, well, I'm not needed right now, so I'm going to drop out. And then it gives the right hemisphere an opportunity to be used.
So one question about that before we wrap up. So is that why adult coloring became such a big thing?
Yes.
As people would it was the tedious thing that you're talking about?
Yes. Okay.
And because so many people would say, I love coloring. And
yes.
And the adult coloring books were so much more complicated than the children's coloring books.
But both enjoy it, right?
Right.
Right. Yeah.
But that makes sense if you're saying it kind of gives permission for the left side of our brain to relax, and that right side to kick in. That's awesome. Thanks for helping to solve the mystery.
Yeah. Well, it's just like gardening, right? You know, like you kind of already know what you need to do, but you have your hands involved, you know, and then you're getting in the ground. It's the same thing. You don't have to think it through. You've already thought it through, but you can actually just enjoy the process. So it's really whatever that creativity looks like for you. Yeah. But yes.
Good. Well, Margaret, thank you so much. And friends, you've been making some great comments. I'm seeing comments from Karen about having an open classroom and exploration stations, from Kim about like how we can rethink education, particularly at this time, and making sure that we don't just stay stuck in the rut that we've been in, because it's been that way since the 1800s. You know, we are in 2020.
Yeah.
The world has changed. So education needs to change too. So yes, to answer your questions, I will be sharing a follow-up email with everyone with links to this conversation and links that both Margaret and I will provide to get you creative for yourself and your mental health and well-being, as well as how you can prime that pump for your students and their families in this pandemic, so to hopefully bring some calm into their households as well. So thank you all for joining us. Margaret, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to get to know you. I look forward to future collaborations. And
absolutely, me too.
Friends, thank you again so much, and we'll see you next time for Love in a Big World. I'm Tamara, and we'll see you later. Bye-bye.